Ejja żmien gawdi l-arja bil-vapur tal-art. Mill-istazzjon ta' Birkirkara tila lejn ħattart. Fil-kampanja bini kważi xejn. Firxet il-eli itbaxxi dawn l-għajnejn.
Niftakar kont għadni żgħir ta' xi 7 snin u kont irkibt mill-inqas 5-6 darbiet fuqha. Konna morru l-Imdina.
I remember I was about 7 years old and I traveled by train 5 or 6 times. We used to go to Mdina. Mother used to take us there, yes. And for a boy that age, it was very exciting. We used to board the train from Valletta through the Yellow Garage, yes, and on towards Mdina. I don't remember how long the journey took, but it used to stop at every station and wait for people to come on board. I have no idea how long the journey took, but it was a beautiful trip.
Il-ħin li tasal sem ma kien sabiħ ħafna dak it-trip.
It has been almost 130 years since the Maltese landscape and the Maltese people have experienced a journey by train, or as it was commonly known as il-vapur tal-art, the steamship on land. The first train journey took place on the 28th of February 1883. However, on paper, the first proposal was made by J. Scott Tucker in 1870. During the next 3 years, another 2 proposals were made, one by Major Hutchinson and the other by Edward Rosenbusch. They both wanted to create an efficient and modern means of transport.
The idea was to have a more advanced means of transport. Let's be frank, before the train, the only means of transport in Malta was by foot or by means of a cart, or else on a horse-drawn cab for those who could have afforded it. There were no other means of transport. The idea to have a train service was naturally the brainchild of the British rulers of that period. In fact, the first company was a British one. No Maltese were involved.
For some reason, however, the Government Council in Malta took only into consideration the proposals made by Hutchinson and Rosenbusch. Shortly afterwards, Hutchinson withdrew his proposal. Only Rosenbusch's proposal was left. The Malta Railway Company Limited, a private company, was set up in June 1879. Work began on the construction of the train stations, the tracks, the embankments and bridges. The one-route track started from Valletta onto Notabile beneath Saqaya Hill in Rabat. It was just over 10.5 kilometers long. For those days, 1880, the tunnel excavated under the Valletta bastions towards the granaries and surfacing in Floriana next to the St. Philip Garden was considered a major engineering feat. It was 1,000 yards long, just over 900 meters. Excavation started from 2 different points. From the starting point where the Yellow Garage was located to the bastions under Port de Baume. Along the route, in the vicinity of the Mall Garden, an underwater reservoir going back to the Knights of Malta was discovered. They had to go around it. In spite of this, and lacking today's modern machinery, the 2 ends of the tunnel met. The difference was only of a few centimeters. Around £10,000 sterling was spent on average to build each mile of the Malta railway infrastructure. The inauguration ceremony took place on the 28th of February 1883 amid great ostentation.
Ir-rotta tiegħu kienet illi mill-terminus kien naturalment il-belt fil-ditx.
Well, the route. The terminus was naturally at the Valletta ditch, with the station building located on the side of the Opera House. A number of ramps were built leading down to the platform, and from there the train proceeded underground beneath Floriana. In fact, Observing the pavement at the Floriana granaries, one can see 3 or 4 gratings which served as ventilation for the tunnel underneath.
Spralli hemm xi tlieta minn is-sejjer żball illi kienu bħala ventilation għat-tan li kien hemm taħt. Issa, kienet
The train serviced near Port de Bombe, and from there was a bridge crossing Princess Melita Road over to the area behind the Braxia Cemetery towards the Myland and arriving at the Hamroon station. The Hamroon station was very large, much larger than the other ones. In fact, it included workshops where maintenance work was carried out. And the trains remained there for the night after their last journey. From Hamroon, the train passed along what is now Psajla Street and arrived at the station here in Birkirkara. From here, it proceeded towards San Anton Gardens, where there was an embankment behind the Corinthia Hotel, on towards Birkirkara Road over the bridge. It then entered the Attard station, which was the only one with a single track and not a double track, where 2 trains could pass near each other. The reason being that the track was downhill. It wasn't on level ground. It was feared that during a rainy day, for instance, the train could be unable to stop because it might skid on the track. That was the reason for the single track. All others had a double track to enable 2 trains to pass next to each other from opposite directions. Trains frequently met here, with 1 train waiting for the next one coming from the direction of Hamroon. 1 train stopped and let the other pass, and then proceed towards Hamroon.
Wieħed kun nieżel jistenna li jħorġ ġej mill-Hamrun, dakka jitlaqgħu joħroġ biex jibqa' sejlej Hamrun. Imbagħad minn Ħattart kellna station ieħor partikolari, ma kienx wieħed minn.
Attard had another station. It wasn't one of the main stations. From the Attard station, the train proceeded towards Old Railway Track. It then passed through a sort of a cutting in the rocks to arrive eventually at the San Salvatore station, as it was known in those times. The area was known as San Salvatore. There was, on the opposite side of Mount Carmel Hospital. In fact, the trees and the bridge are still there, and from there the train proceeded on its journey. This route was normally used by hospital employees and visitors. From there, it proceeded towards Rabat. There was another station beneath Saqajja Hill, the Notabile station, and the terminus was situated there up to the 1900. The train passed along the hospital parallel to the road leading from Zebbuġ to Rabat until it arrived at the station. In 1900, a tunnel was excavated beneath Mdina, and it was extended towards Mtarfa. The reason for the Mtarfa extension was probably due to location of the hospital and also to the barracks.
L-isptar u l-barracks li kien hemm il-barrakka, fil-xisma u l-Mtarfa.
The train revolutionized the concept of transport, especially with regard to the duration of the journey. A journey from Valletta to Mdina by cab took over 3 hours, and the price was 8 shillings. The train journey took only 35 minutes, and the cost ranged from 10 pence for first class to 2 for the workers' class. At first, there were 16 journeys every day, 8 from Valletta towards Notabile station beneath Saqajja Hill and 8 on the return journey. The first trip left Notabile station at 5:30 in the morning. The last trip, also from Notabile station, left at 12 minutes past 7 in the evening. Towards the end of its lifespan, the train schedule was extended to 14 trips from Mdina to Valletta and vice versa. As time went by, more people began travelling by train, to go to work, to attend village festas, to visit their relatives. Moreover, the regularity in the calendar of feasts those days, and even nowadays, led to regular scheduled trips.
Kulħadd kien jużaw, kulħadd kien ħaddiema, nies li jmorru l-uffiċċju, kollha.
Everyone used the train. Workers, people going to the office, everyone. It was a very popular means of transport covering long distances. And those days there was no bus service, and it was the train that was the only means of transport. Everybody used the train, but the carriages denoted different classes of society. We had first class, second class and third class. The prices were naturally different, but everybody ended up using it. It was, how can I say, a nice sort of thing to travel on.
Kienet insomma, ma tafx ħaġa, kienet it was nice, sort of thing to travel on, and it was sweet.
Biex niftakar oġġetti li baqgħu fil-memorja tiegħi.
I remember in particular one thing, which is very vivid and very strong in my memory. Before the train departed, there was a young man or a young boy who used to come to light a candle in every carriage where the passengers were seated. He used to light a lantern so that every time the train traveled along the tunnel from Valletta to Floriana, in front of the Fenicia Hotel, the carriages were lit for passengers on board, and the lantern was lit for all the duration of the trip, every time the train traveled underground.
All the carriages were illuminated by candlelight, with the exception of the governor's carriage, where instead of candles, the carriage was lit by means of electricity, with accumulators attached to a dynamo, which worked by means of a belt connected to the axle of the carriage wheels. In 1900, however, the carriages were no longer lit by candlelight, but by a number of light bulbs operated with batteries. When the train service started in Malta in 1883, 3 brand new engines were bought, together with 7 carriages. In spite of the fact that year after year the number of passengers kept increasing, the expenditure was higher than revenue, and the enterprise started losing money. Until in 1890, it was declared bankrupt because of debts. Just before its bankruptcy, a 4th engine had been bought. Every engine those days cost £1,000 sterling. When it went bankrupt and the assets of the Malta Railway were about to be auctioned, the local government intervened and took over. Between 1890 and 1892, the local government paid off the company's debts, changed all the tracks and carried out works to strengthen the infrastructure. In February 1892, the train service resumed its operations. 2 more engines were bought, which cost £2,000 sterling each, as well as 17 new carriages. The 10 engines had 3 different ways in which the wheels were positioned. Engines 1 to 4 had 6 wheels. Engine 5 had 10 wheels, while engines 6 to 10 had 12 wheels. For the Malta Railway, passengers were the greatest source of income. Contrary to other countries, the Malta Railway did not carry merchandise. It only carried an iron box, which served as a letter box, where passengers and people in every train station could post their mail. There were 3 different tariffs for the train journeys: a penny for every mile in a first-class carriage, a penny halfpenny for every mile in a second-class carriage, and a special tariff for workers who used to pay 2pence for a trip between Valletta and Rabat.
I have never seen a penny or a penny halfpenny used in those days. No, I never saw them, but it was very cheap. They say there was a special price for workers at certain hours and a normal price for passengers.
The tariffs were very cheap even for those days and indicate that the local government considered the railway as an essential component of Malta's economic development, so much so that the price of land went up in those areas where the railway passed. It is obvious that government intended assisting the railway, which spearheaded so much local economic development. On paper, the idea was, rather the plans in fact show, a service extending beyond the Valletta-Mdina route.
Oriġinarjament kien hemm pjani.
Yes, originally there were plans for the railway to extend its route towards Mellieħa, towards Attard in the direction of Mosta, and Mellieħa, and also from Hamrun, I believe from Ormi to Zebbuġ, if I'm not mistaken. And there were also plans to create a small railway route in Gozo. The first plans were presented. In fact, it seems that there were more than one plan, and discussions with government, and one of them even proposed a small one for Gozo, from Imġar to Rabat, actually.
The train, il-ferrovija għat ma kienet ta' good service għal poplu ta' Malta.
However, this train never offered a good service to the people of Malta, because people who lived in Sliema, in Marsa Xlok and in other localities, well, the train did not go to Marsa Xlok to cater for the people's needs, and so carts and cabs had to be used.
At the peak of its operations, the Malta Railway had 33 carriages for passengers, apart from open-air carriages for workers. Not all engines catered for the same number of carriages. Engines 1, 2, 3 pulled up to 5 carriages. Engine 4 pulled up to 5 carriages. And engines 5 to 10 pulled between 10 to 12 carriages. All the engines of the Malta Railway were ordered from or were built in England from Manning Wardle of Leeds, Bayer Peacock of Manchester and Black Hawthorne of Gateshead. The Malta Railway engines were slightly different from those in other countries.
L-unika ħaġa illi l-ferroviji ta' Malta l-ilma.
The only thing regarding the trains, well, they did not transport a water tank at the back of the train. The train carried its water supply like a camel, with 2 water tanks on each side. Coal and wood used to be stored behind the driver, so the train used to stock on board all its supplies.
On many occasions there used to be a plank between one carriage and another, used by the conductor to pass from one carriage to the next, to check that all passengers had a ticket, and to sell tickets to those without a ticket, or else to report a passenger to the police.
We used to enjoy boarding the train. I was still only about 8 or 9 years old, and as children, we used to pretend to climb on board and hide to avoid paying the ticket. We were children. The conductor used to come and pretend not to see us and keep on going. Children's pranks.
Generally, a third-class carriage carried between 24 to 28 passengers. They sat on a long wooden bench along the side of the train. Many times people used also to stand in the carriages, the same as on buses nowadays.
Sempliċi ħafna kienu.
Well, they were very simple indeed. It was a small train. It was a little train, not like the trains in countries in Europe. Era un trenino.
Did you sit or stand?
I used to sit when there I found a seat, and then when it was full, you had to stand, but it was not really that full.
It was slightly different on first-class carriages. The carriage was longer and more spacious. The bench was made of mahogany with a cushion on the seat. Those days only public service officials, rich businessmen, well-off people and British Navy officers used these carriages. In sharp contrast, there were carriages reserved for workers. These had a roof, but the sides had no windows and were open to the elements. Every carriage carried 40 passengers, packed like sardines. Every train journey started with a typically Victorian ritual. The journey from Valletta or Imtarfa started off with the clanging of a bell and the blowing of a whistle. The tickets were sold from a small kiosk or office in every station. It was also quite normal for the train to stop in between stations to board passengers. There was a guardhouse before every station or where the track crossed a street or a main road. The guardhouse was manned by a guard whose job was to position a chain when the train arrived so that no one could cross the lines. He also used a white flag to indicate to the train driver that the train could keep on going. During its 50-year lifespan, the Malta Railway never experienced serious incidents due to the excellent maintenance works carried out on the lines and on the train infrastructure. In almost 50 years, there was only one accident in which, owing to damages on the rail, the train derailed, but no one was injured. This does not mean there were no memorable accidents, among them when a large number of bulls were killed on the 22nd of July 1923.
Dak kien jiżel it-train ta' 8 l-aħħar wieħed mir-Rabat. In the meantime, kienu tilejn merħla barri mix-xatt.
The 8 o'clock train, the last train, had left Rabat. In the meantime, a herd of bulls was being taken to their farms in Santa Venera near the old church. There were a number of farms there, and the bulls were being taken there. The guard at the level crossing had already positioned the chain because the train was approaching, but the bulls could not be stopped and they kept going on the lines while the train was approaching. They were hit by the oncoming train, and a large number of them were killed. The train derailed, but none of the train personnel or the passengers were seriously injured. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, they remained there until around 10 o'clock at night, until the lines were cleared, and then another train left from Hamrun to pick up the passengers from the derailed train.
Magna oħra mill-Hamrun, għax il-magna l-oħra kienet barra mill-xismu, barra mill-rejls, u waslet il-passiġġieri dak il-ħin.
During the 50-year lifespan of the Malta Railway, a climax was reached in 1926. That year, the trains carried more than 1,600,000 passengers at a time, when the Maltese population totaled not more than 300,000. In spite of this, it was never commercially viable, when operated by a private company and later by government. The company only made a profit during 16 years of its operation. By 1931, when the Malta Railway service ceased to operate, the debts had reached almost £40,000, 93,000 euros. Today, there are only a few remains of the industrial archaeology of this chapter in the history of transport in Malta. As regards train stations, only those in Floriana, Hamrun, Notabile and Imtarfa remain. There is only one carriage left at Birkirkara. It is in a very bad state and has been vandalized. No railway lines remain. The only remaining rails have been stacked on each other at the Birkirkara Garden station. From 14 guard huts, not one has been conserved. Only a couple of embankments are left nowadays, one in Attard and one in the countryside between Attard and Rabat. We still find the tunnels which were dug under the bastions, leading from Valletta to Floriana. or those under Saqaya Hill, which surface under the Mdina bastions at the foot of Imtarfa. The death knell of the Malta Railway sounded in 1905 with the introduction of the tram, which provided transport from Valletta to Msida and Hamrun. Soon afterwards, the tram service was extended to other localities such as Cottonera and Zebuch, which had never been reached by the railway. The extended tram routes and the much cheaper tariffs led to a strong competition in the transport sector, which increased when the first buses, or omnibuses as they were known, were introduced.
Bħalmet fil-bidu jiena naħseb li kien hemm żewġ affarijiet li waslu għal x'ismu.
There were two reasons, really. First of all, a big mistake was made with the introduction of the tram because the trains were still operating. Another reason is the advent of buses, because the tram began operating in 1905, much later than the railway, and stopped before the train operations had ceased. The tram ceased to operate in 1929, while the Malta Railway ceased operations in 1931, 2 years later. The tram travelled from Citygate. In fact, until some years ago, the structure could still be seen, and even in old places. And from Valletta it also proceeded to Hamrun, along the road by the church, St. Joseph Road from Birkirkara, and then on to Fradigo Square, where there was a siding which led to Ormi, and then on to Zebuch. There was another siding in Blat al-Bajda, leading to Cottonera up to Poccospicua.
Fil-Blat al-Bajda kien hemm siding ieħor li kien jixbet l-Cottonera, kien jmur sa Bormla.
The final journey by train took place on the 31st of March 1931. The Malta Railway had been travelling between the old capital Mdina to the new capital Valletta for almost half a century. Nowadays we travel between these two towns many times, just as our ancestors used to do. Nowadays we travel by car, and we rarely remember that in the same streets and roads, in the past, there was another means of transport, which catered for the travelling needs of our grandfathers. Only a few traces remain, but the memory of the Malta Railway lives on.
Album ritratti lura fi żmien pajjiż ieħor milli nafih titħabbebni bla ma trid u kemm nixtieq impara l-ftit li jerġa' dak iż-żmien mill-ġdid li jerġa' dak iż-żmien mill-ġdid.